I'm Nancy Bowen, Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Earlham School of Religion, and I'm here to have a chat with my colleague Grace Kim about her new book, Invisible. Look, there it is.
I'm so excited. Yes.
Hi, Grace.
Hi, Nancy. Thanks so much.
Yeah, well, I know after all the trauma you've experienced with this book that to hold it in your hands must be very exciting.
So much trauma. Like I think the most trauma and most, everything for this book, because as you recall, and I must first
You wrote
apologize.
about it at the end,
And then I misspelled your last name, but I hope everyone knows it's you that I'm referring to. But yeah, my computer crashed and lost all my files. And so that was last spring. And then in the fall, I got so ill. So just one thing after another, it just stalled so much of my work. And so to get this book out, it's so exciting, Nancy, because and also this is my 20th book, and it's coming out November, and I actually graduated November 2001, which was 20 years ago.
Wow.
So it's
nice.
I know. So it's
nice.
so I know I'm one of those people not obsessed with numbers, but when numbers match like that, I'm like, oh my gosh, 20 and 20. So it's a thrill, and it's so great. I know you're retired and you're Professor Emeritus, but thank you so much for holding the book launch for me. This is such a thrill to have you, because I really wanted a woman professor to do this with me. And so you were the perfect one. So thank you so much. I know you're busy and you're trying to relax after you move, but thank you so much.
Sure. It was, I learned a lot from reading it. So what inspired you to write it?
I think as I write other books, it's just certain ideas that spur me. And for this one, for a long time, I felt that I have been invisible as an Asian American woman. And I just thought it's about time now to write it. And I think with the pandemic, I started writing it way before the pandemic, but as the pandemic hit and the AAPI hate crimes were happening, and they're still happening, violent and verbal abuse, killings, I think it's just so important to share my experience and how Asian Americans are living and understanding the history. My 3 kids were born in Canada, but they all went to school from kindergarten here in the US, and none of them were actually ever taught Asian American history. So we don't teach Asian American history. So I thought I'll write a book that has a bit of the Asian American history and reflect on it theologically, and then also bring my life in. I think this, I usually bring a bit of myself into all my books, but this one, Invisible, I think I brought the most in. And so when I was doing the copy editing, I got really nervous because I thought maybe these experiences and stories shouldn't be in it. And I was contemplating, should I delete it? But it was so late in the game. I thought, I can't, if I delete it, half the book will be gone and I have to rewrite everything again. So I kept it in, and I'm a little afraid of how people will respond. But now it's out. So I don't know. I hope people will learn from it and understand how Asian Americans are living and experiencing and doing theology and being a Christian and being a citizen in this continent. So it's exciting for me. So thank you so much, Nancy.
Well, I would say that actually one of the strengths of the book are the stories, the very personal stories you tell about yourself and your family. And some of them were, I have to admit, were very hard to read, mostly because I'm like going, oh my God, white people were so terrible. It was just like, oh, it's just so embarrassing to be a white person these days. But thank you for sharing those stories. And I was just going to ask you, is it difficult to share those parts of yourself in such a public way as putting them in a book?
It is very hard. I think I've been doing it over the last 10 years when I'm blogging, and then now with my podcast, Madame. And when I speak, I do share. And then a few weeks ago, when I was speaking at a church, that was the first time I shared about when I was in my PhD program.
Mhm.
It was either my first or second year. So this is 20 years ago, or actually more than that,
Mhm.
because I graduated 20 years ago, where the professor called me in um, to her office and told me, I don't think you're cut out for
Mhm.
this program. And, I was devastated. I thought of quitting.
Mhm.
So that was the first time I shared that story. So now that I shared it publicly and now I'm sharing it here, I may write about it. It's so hard for me sometimes. And people think, oh, Grace is sharing so much. Every time I share something, it's not that easy, but I feel like um, to understand my theology, to understand who God is, I really need to reflect theologically on my own life and my own story. In my first year class at ESR, one of my first assignments for Intro to Theology is to write a theological reflection paper. So they have to choose one experience and reflect it. So
Mhm.
I have been doing it for a long time, since I was a grad student and during my PhD program. So I make my students do it. I don't know if everyone appreciates it, but they all hand in their assignment. But it is to really see where God is in their life. And so, some of these stories were very painful. And I thought maybe I shouldn't include it. Maybe I should wait till some people are no longer here with
Mhm.
me. But I thought, okay, it just fits right in. So it was hard, Nancy, for me to share, but I hope when people read it that they will learn and it will impact them in some way.
Well, it fits very much in with your idea of how to develop a theology of visibility, because one of the things you comment on several times is the need for Asian American women to tell their stories.
Yeah.
And part of what makes anyone invisible is not being able to tell your story. And so I think that's a very critical part of your theology, is sharing your story of your own experiences and encouraging other Asian American women to share their stories of their experiences, because it's only by by over and expanding the stories and hearing more and more of the stories that people start to understand just what the dynamics are and what's going on and why things are a problem.
Yeah.
That particularly Asian American things like with feminist theology, and even because you talk about issues like domestic violence and abuse and stuff, and Christian communities like, oh, that doesn't happen here, or even in the larger culture of like, oh, well, that doesn't really happen, and women being gaslit, and it's like, oh no, that didn't really happen to you or whatever. And it's only as more and more and more and more women have come forward to share their stories of, of domestic violence and sexual violence and abuse, that more and more of society has been able to understand how this impacts women's lives.
Yeah. And I think white women had a hard time sharing, but I think other groups of women also have a very difficult time sharing, and
Right.
particularly
I mean,
in the in the
yeah.
Asian
Hmm.
community, where we are living in an honor shame system. So it's hard, and I struggle with it a lot. But I feel if we don't hear women's voices, particularly the Asian American women's voices,
Hmm.
then we are going to continue to be invisible in the society.
Hmm.
So I'm hoping that I will encourage other women to speak up about domestic violence and sexual
Hmm.
violence that happens in the Asian American community. Most times when it happens in churches, nobody wants to share it
Hmm.
because it's so shameful, even though they
Hmm.
know it's wrong, nobody
Hmm.
wants to bring it up. So it's just made, you know,
Right.
silenced. Everybody is silenced about it.
Um,
But
had
I
that
think we really,
had the same experience in East Africa when I was in both Tanzania and Kenya. I mean, it's how do you talk about these issues when like it's considered shameful to even say the R word, rape? It's
Mhm.
like if you can't even say the word or admit that it happened, how can you begin to address it? But again, it's like, but you're taught that experience is shameful, and you don't want to shame your family, and you don't want to shame your community by talking about these things. And it's one of those things. Jewish scholar Naomi Gretz, because the same thing happens in the Jewish community of like, oh, you can't talk about this, or you can't raise this issue because it's shameful. And it's like, well, which is more shameful, the fact that that it happened, or that we won't talk about it?
Yeah.
So it's hard. Yeah.
It is very hard. So, and as theologians and biblical scholars, we have to deal with the text and understand how are we supposed to understand these difficulties
Mhm.
of rape and violence against women. So I try to approach it and address in some of the parts of the book. And, but
Mhm.
culturally, women are suffering everywhere.
Mhm.
So I hope that my book, Invisible, will help those women who are struggling as immigrants or living in other parts of the world, like Africa and Asia and South America, because women, and as Christians, we have kind of put women down, made them subordinate, and we have misinterpreted scripture in that way to do it. So, we still have a long way to go. We have made some progress with biblical feminist scholars and
Mhm.
feminist theologians, but we still have so much more to go.
So you mentioned that one of the ways Asian Americans are invisible is that their their challenges and experiences of discrimination are often just absent from discussions around civil rights and racism, especially in the US. And I
Yeah.
know when I moved to New Jersey, it was the first time I had lived east of the Colorado, east of the Rockies. And so it's the first time I had experienced racism primarily being talked about in terms of Black and white. And at times when I would try to say, um, where I come from, we have different categories of talking about race, because in New Mexico, it's around indigenous peoples and Hispanic culture, and Anglo is sort of the latecomers, and it's a primarily minority, it's a minority majority state. And having lived up and down the West Coast, where there are so many Asian Americans, and the experiences of Japanese internment and of the Chinese and stuff is much more prominent in the cultural consciousness. But every time I tried to raise that, I was shut down
Mhm.
totally in the discussion. So I was just wondering, in your own experiences of interracial dialogue, what has worked for you in helping to bring visibility to the experiences of Asian Americans?
I think so. My book, I tried to bring in some of the historical aspects, just as you mentioned, the Japanese internment, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. Asians couldn't vote till 1943. Many of the white dominant culture has no clue what Asian Americans went through at all. They don't know our history, how we came through Angel Island. White Europeans came through Ellis Island. Ellis Island, they were processed in a couple hours. They just stamped you and then you went in. And they were actually a lot of the poor people, with the potato famine, people were very poor. While as in Asia, they tried to send the smartest, the healthiest, people. But when they came to Angel Island, they were processed as prisoners. So if you've ever visited Angel Island, it feels like a prison complex. I visited the place where they were processed. Some of them were processed for days and weeks, months, and some of them took years. So they were just held there in like these holding cells for a long time. So right from the beginning of migration, white Europeans versus Asians, you see a difference in how they were processed because there was so much fear of Asians, yellow peril, all these
Mm.
fear, xenophobia, it still exists today. That's why we have, AAPI hate crimes happening because people want to blame somebody for something that happens that goes wrong in society. So if we don't understand our past, what Asian Americans experience and what they continue to experience, then we will never be able to overcome some of these difficulties. So up in Canada, when I grew up, we didn't use the term people of color. The government had visible minority.
Mm,
So I was a visible minority, but in a weird way, we become invisible
mm,
in a sense. But we were called visible minority because we looked different from the
mhm,
white dominant society. When I moved to the US in 2004, all of a sudden, overnight, I became a woman of color. So as a woman of color, I realized that racism here in the US is discussed in black and white terms. And if you do that, then any kind of experience that the Hispanic Latinx community, Asian Americans, Native Americans experience, it just kind of gets pushed aside and pushed to the margins. And everything is talked about in black and white terms. So we can't keep talking about it in black and white terms, because if you do, then my experiences as an Asian American always is turned to, oh, that wasn't racism. Every time I bring up racism,
mm.
either in the academy, in the church, in seminary setting, it doesn't matter. Majority of the time, people will say that was not racism because I'm not Black. So we cannot continue that conversation. Racism happens to all people of color. And so if we continue saying that and using these when we use terms like model minority myth or honorific whites, then that means that we are so great that of course nothing bad will happen to you because you are the model minority. You go to the good universities, you get the jobs. But that's not true. There's a lot of homeless and a lot of people who don't have jobs, don't have the economic status, that didn't go to the best schools here in the continent. So we have to get rid of these terms, because otherwise we will never be able to fight against this discrimination, racism, and xenophobia that so many of us Asian Americans face. When I wake up in the morning, I can't get rid of my Asianness. People will know I'm Asian by my name, by my features, by what I eat and how I, dress. I can't get rid of it. So, I think what theology and what Christianity needs to do is we have to be able to understand that we are all created in God's image, that we need to not discriminate and not hate and not be fearful of one another. But as when you just retired, but at ESR Quakers, that of God in everyone. If we understand that the Spirit of God resides in all of us, then it makes it so much easier for us to welcome, to love, and to embrace, and to just be a loving and peaceful community. But when we don't understand the history and the past, when we don't understand that what people are doing to me is actually racism, that racism is systemic, it's part of the society, it's part of how people are hired and retained, and what happens in the classroom, all of that we have to be aware. And if we don't, it's just going to continue. We're going to continue to discriminate and marginalize and have systemic racism here in the US and other places around the world.
So have you been in any small groups or other groups where you find that larger discussion happening? I mean, I know where the problem is. I just wonder if you see any progress anywhere.
I when I go into small group settings or things like that, unless people ask me specifically, racism is still discussed in black and white terms. I think it's just been part of our American history. And we have to go beyond, and I think part of that problem is this dualistic thinking. It's very Western dualistic thinking. Christianity is very dualistic. We think in dualistic terms, heaven and earth, wisdom and spirit, male and female. It's so ingrained that we think that way in so many ways, but we have to kind of move away from that if we are going to dismantle racism. As Asian Americans, we are with Black Lives Matter, and we need to be in solidarity with other people of color, because racism hurts all of us. So we need to be in solidarity with one another and fight the systemic racism that is so ingrained. And I think even within Christianity, there is so much unpacking to do. When I do theology, for myself, for half my life, it was always a white God. It was so hard for me to challenge that. And it was a white Jesus, and on top of it, of course, a male white God. I think we really need to reimagine doctrines, reimagine our history, our traditions, our theology, and do a lot of dismantling and reconstructing. Because how in the world why are we saying God is white? God is not white, but it happens. And that, it just, when you keep preaching that on a Sunday morning, it does not help dismantle racism. It only says white people are closer to God. White people were made in the image of God, and everyone else, Asians, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, we are not close to God. We are not created in God's image. So we have to change the narrative. And, it happens in the classroom. It happens in our churches, in our Bible studies. It happens in the family. But a lot needs to happen because we still hold on to this white Jesus. My mother had that famous white Jesus painting in our living room forever. She carried it around every time we moved, and she posted it right above our sofa so that we can see it every day, And so I think a lot needs to happen. Theological reimagination needs to happen, and we need different voices at the table. We need Black women, we need queer, we need poor, we have a lot of rich, so maybe not so much rich, but we need everybody. Asian Americans, Latinx, Native Americans, we need men and women, we need children, we need elderly, we need everybody at the table, because to understand God, it's so difficult. We are so limited in our finite minds. We can't understand the infinite. So we need the different voices to help us. So I'm hoping that my book, Invisible, will be just one help along the path, along the journey that people are taking to understand God and understand God's presence in their life.
So let's talk a little theology. So one of the ways that a very tiny way that biblical studies has tried to sort of decolonize itself is, instead of talking about the Eastern Mediterranean as the ancient Near East, because it's only Near East if you're standing in Europe, is to stand from a continental perspective and describe it as Western Asia. And so have you ever envisioned Jesus as a Western Asian?
I've never used that term, Western Asian, but
well,
I think that's a good way.
This is, like I said, it's a very tiny way that biblical studies has tried to work on decolonizing, but to shift from Eurocentric perspective to an Asian perspective, which then puts that whole area as Western Asia.
And I think it's always good to use different languages to challenge our minds and our ways of thinking. I think it's very helpful, because in our dualistic mind, West is better than the East. It's always been taught that way. We teach it to our little kids that West is better than the East, but to reconfigure and understand, why is North when we look at the whole solar system or the whole universe, really, what is North and what is South and what is East and what is West? We don't know, because this is just created by us. It's all relative. So I think we need new language, and you bringing in that new perspective as a biblical scholar. I use different languages for spirit from my own Asian context. I use Chi, and I will be speaking about reimagining spirit at ESR next spring at that lecture. So I'm always excited to have new language, have new concepts to challenge the way we have always been thinking, to kind of move move the center or decenter or make multiple centers. I think there's so much that needs to be done. Challenging the status quo is another thing.
So one of the things that I learned in your book is the 4 Korean concepts that you use to talk about some Christian language. So just as I will keep trying to teach you how to say ruach, I'm going to ask you to teach me how to say the words that the 4 terms that you use. I know han and I know chi. Is it uri?
Uri. Yeah, you're very
Uri,
close. Uri.
uri.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uri.
And then what's the other one? Jiang?
Chong. Chong.
Zhang?
Yeah,
Chang.
Chong. So you
Chang.
said it correctly. Yeah.
Okay.
So those, yeah. So Han, I think, is probably most familiar with people who have read any Asian American theology. Andrew Sung Park kind of brought it in. It's it's a Korean.
I read about Han when I was in seminary in the mid 80s. So
that's great. And I think everybody in seminary, because it's such a helpful term.
It is.
Yeah, because when we think about Korea, it's a small little peninsula. So we were always attacked by other nations like China or Japan, because we're so tiny, there's nowhere else to go.
This is the whole story of the Bible, of ancient Israel. It was this little tiny country that was constantly being attacked by larger, like Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. It's the same story.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's why we love reading those stories, because as Koreans, we were attacked and we were colonized by Japanese. And so there are these collective experiences of unjust suffering. So as a Korean collectiveness, the whole country, we felt this unjust suffering. So we bring that into the theological language, because whenever someone is sinned against, if someone is raped, someone is attacked, someone is murdered, someone is discriminated or feeling racism, those are unjust suffering. It can be a physical unjust suffering, mental, spiritual. There are different ways that we suffer in our bodies. And so this is unjust suffering. So it helps us as theologians understand that this unjust suffering happens, and we as Christians should try to work towards justice to prevent the unjust suffering from occurring. So it's very important when we're doing social justice work and when we're doing liberation theology. So that term has been helpful. The other term, chi, is the Asian concept of spirit. So, I think, so many now thinkers are saying there are less differences and more similarities between people. And I think that approach to life may be a little helpful, especially if we're doing interfaith dialogue, especially if we're trying to welcome new immigrants into the US, welcoming refugees, understanding that we are very similar, even though there are differences. So if you examine different world religions, you'll see that they all have this concept of spirit. It may be a different word, but they have this concept of spirit, and most of it's associated with the divine, with God. And so this chi is a helpful term in that it's a concept which is translated the same way as ruha and pneuma. I know I'm not saying it right. As wind and breath and spirit and life-giving spirit and energy. It's the same definition for a different word in a different language. So chi and ki, we say it differently. It's a helpful way for us to understand that the Spirit of God is within us. It's a very more tangible understanding. I think in the West, we know of Reiki. I've had many students practice Reiki on me, or Tai Chi. People know those terms. And it has to do with the spirit within our body. When the Chi is moving in a wrong way, it causes illness and harm in our body. So we really have this wholeness understanding of the spirit. And, as as Christians, we always talk about the Spirit of God within you. We say it in that way. So it's not much different. So I bring that in as another way to think and expand our theological language and vocabulary. So Chong is another term that's very helpful when we're understanding love. Chong is a very specific Korean term. And so I always find Koreans and Italians are similar. We use our hands. We're very emotional people, I think. And I think that's why these K-dramas are so addictive, because they're so emotional. Like there's a history behind everything and everybody's connected in some way, which is very different from Western shows and Western movies and drama. So if you get hooked on K-drama or Korean movies, it has those similar elements. And what is kind of embedded in our Korean culture is this Chong understanding. So Chong is almost like love, but it's not, it's like that's how Western people will understand it, but it is kind of beyond this love. It is this connectedness. When you put your hand in a jar of honey, it's very sticky. It's very hard to get rid of that honey. In the same way, this Chong between me and you, Nancy, as we were colleagues, it's hard to break it. So in Korean society, like if you have a professor that you graduate, that professor is your professor for life. You can't break that connection. It's a Chong feeling. Even if you fight, you still have this connection, this Chong feeling with the other person.
So do you know the Hebrew word davak?
No.
Okay.
Is it the same? Similar?
Okay. So one of the first times it is used is in Genesis 2:24. Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings. Davak is the word for cling to his wife.
Need to use that
and they become one flesh. And in Ruth, the same verb is used to talk about how Ruth clings to Naomi.
Oh, okay. You have to send me that word.
And then like in Deuteronomy, many times it says, you will diligently observe this entire commandment that I am commanding you, loving the Lord your God, walking in all his ways, and holding fast, davaking. You are clinging fast to God.
Okay. Yeah.
Or in, let's see, Psalm 63:8, my soul, davak, clings to you, your right hand upholds me. So so again, it's not, the Hebrew word for love is ahev, and then there's chesed, which is sort of steadfast love. But I always describe davak as sort of super glue.
Okay, yeah. So that
you are stuck together to each other.
That super glue is a better way than to say in the Asian understanding of clinging, because clinging always, it feels like a dependency.
Right. But it's not. It's like the hold fast is.
So Chong, even though you fight, there's this connection to you, and you just can't break it. So it's unbreakable. It is this connectedness. And so when
maybe that can be like another Eastern Asian kind of synergy.
And so but it is very helpful in a theological sense, in the sense that we are all connected in a way, and we are connected to God, and that's very scriptural. What this Bible better than me, West or East, we cannot separate from the love of God. You know the Bible passage better than me, but nothing can separate us from the love of God. We are connected to God. There is this Chong between us and God, and you cannot break this bond between us. So it is a very helpful term. And if we understand that there is Chong between all of us, then we can start to love rather than hate in this world. And we need lots of Chong in our society to overcome, we began the conversation with racism and discrimination, to overcome those problems in our society. And then the other fourth term, uri, when we speak English, we we use a lot of pronouns.
Mhm.
And so, when we say I all the time, I go to the store, I ate this. In Korean language, we rarely use pronouns like that, and we don't say I that much, hardly ever. Or people may,
Mhm.
but even though we know I is inferred in the sentence, we don't use it as much. Here in the English language, if we don't use it, we're all confused. Who are you talking about? Are you talking about yourself or the other person?
Mhm.
So the English language requires us. In Asian language, we don't. In the Korean language, not so much. You don't need the pronouns. So it's inferred, I ate. You don't have to say I.
Mhm.
People will know that you ate. So we don't use I as much, but what we do use is our, the word our, a lot. So, which is 우리. So 우리 means our. So we don't say I'm going to my church. We say we're going to our church. Even though you're the only one speaking and you're only speaking to
Mhm.
another person, you never say I'm going to my church. You say I'm going to our church. You don't say my family. We say our family. You don't say my husband, even though there's no polygamy. We say our husband. So it is a sense of this community. And, you don't say my mother, even though you are the only child. You still say our mother. So 우리 is very important. It's a sense of community. We live in a communal society, and it teaches us to take care of one another. It teaches us that we are one big family. And I think bringing that into the theological discourse is so helpful to overcome all these racism and discriminations, phobia, when it comes to people of other faith traditions. If we understand 우리, and that we are connected by Chong, and that the Spirit of God is in everyone. And if we don't understand this, it will cause so much harm. I think if we kind of grapple with these four terms that I do talk about in the book, I think we can create a better community, better church, better seminary, better country, a better world for all of us to live in.
Overall, I thought all four terms were helpful in terms of pushing against the dualism of Greek philosophy that
Yes.
is so embedded in the New Testament and so much of Western theology in general, that I thought they
Yeah.
were very helpful in that regard. So, well, we have
Yeah.
gone on much longer than the 20 minutes that you wanted to.
But it's so much fun talking with you, Nancy. We miss you a lot here at
Yeah,
ESR.
I miss you all too.
We talk about you a lot. We think that you should not have left us. So I'm so glad that we can connect in this way,
Sure.
and hope we will
Yeah.
have more connections like this.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for reading my
You're-
book and
yeah,
discussing
it
it.
was
And
my
yeah.
honor to do so.
Oh, thank you. And thank you again. And I apologize again for misspelling your name in my book. But
Like I
I
said,
am
I know who
grateful.
I am. So
Yeah. And I'm just so
so
grateful for your support and
you're
with
very
Stephanie's
welcome.
support. Yeah. So thank you so much to my wonderful colleagues. It's so great to speak with you. And I hope many people will read it, and that you will encourage your community down there in Texas
I
to read it
will.
too.
I
Yeah.
will. New Mexico.
Oh, New Mexico. Okay.
Close to
I'm
Texas.
sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know. I was thinking of
Yes.
AAR. That's
Oh,
why.
that's right. Oh, that's true. That's true. We're just right next door to Texas.
Yeah,
So.
I was thinking, yes.
Right.
Sorry about that. Huge difference.
That's right. How to piss off a New Mexican.
Yeah.
Say you're from Arizona or Texas. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nancy.